Encouraged to see you here. We are on the last Sunday of this year, and we're right at the edge of another year. And so we're going to look in Joshua chapter 3. That passage in Psalms is describing that in a poetical way. But if you will, turn to Joshua chapter 3, and this, of course, is about the crossing of the Jordan River. There is a book, and the title of that book is The Meaning of Rivers. And the author describes rivers in American literature and how they act and what happens there. But the one thing that the author emphasizes about rivers is its flow. Rivers flow. Rivers continue. In fact, here's a quote from that book. Rivers move, flowing over land, through history, and among diverse groups of people, changing considerably from their source to their destination. They also stay permanent blue lines on our maps, constant waypoints and lasting landmarks. Rivers connect. They connect state with state, interior with exterior, region with region, the past with the present, but they also separate. They separate nations, subcultures, and families. They separate. Rivers separate. And there are different ways of experiencing a river. Sometimes we just want to sit beside the river and look at the river. But sometimes if you have to cross the river, you have to experience it in a different way. And also, you never experience the same river twice in the same way. In fact, I preached this sermon, I think 2 years ago, and yet I preached this sermon, but I didn't preach the sermon because, as one of the philosophers said, you can't step in the same river twice. The water just keeps flowing. So a lot of the main points, a lot of the same thoughts are from 2 years ago, but it's different because this is a new situation. We're here. There are people who are here who weren't here 2 years ago. And those of us who were here 2 years ago, we will probably hear in a different way because we're at a different point in our life. We're 2 years from where we were 2 years ago. So Israel is called, as in Joshua chapter 3, not just sit beside the river and contemplate and experience the river and think about the river. They're called to cross the river. This river is a barrier to God's promise of the promised land. Now, as you probably know, in the book of Joshua, Joshua sends out spies into the land. They've returned from Jericho, and they followed Joshua's orders, and they come back with the majority say, we can't do it. It's just overwhelming. But the minority say, with God's help, we can. It is a big obstacle. People are like giants, we're like grasshoppers, and so on. But with God's help, we can do this. And you have the account of Rahab, that famous account in chapter 2 of Joshua. And then look at chapter 2, verse 24. It says, and they said to Joshua, these are the spies, the Lord has indeed handed us over to all the land. Furthermore, all the inhabitants of the land have despaired because of us. And that's the news that Joshua wanted to hear. All the land has despaired because of us. And he sent runners throughout the camp of Israel. Get ready. They'll break camp and we're going to cross over. I think I messed up in looking at 2 spy episodes and putting them together here. This is not the same as the one that caused the 40-year wandering in the wilderness. Joshua sends out spies, and these spies come back and they say in verse 24, the Lord has handed this over to us. All the inhabitants of the land have despaired because of us. So finally they've come to the point where they can cross into this promised land. And then look at chapter 3, verse 1. Joshua started early in the morning. Then Joshua got up early in the morning. He and all the sons of Israel set out, and that place is Shittim, or Acacia, maybe as the newer translations have, and came to the Jordan, and they spent the night there before they crossed. Now we know from Verse 2, that they spent more than one night, because it says at the end of 3 days, the officers go about. So for 3 days, they're there. The journey from Shittim to the Jordan River is about an 8-mile journey, and it's pretty smooth. Now they get to the Jordan, and the Jordan is the obstacle that they have to cross. Think about this. They're probably saying, this is the day. This is the day when God has promised that we will have this promised land. This is the day, but there is that barrier, the Jordan River. And the Jordan, at this point, was uncrossable. You can't cross the Jordan. Look at verse 15 of chapter 3. There's a simple sentence here that gives us the picture. It says, it's describing when they go into the Jordan, but it says, when those who are carrying the ark came to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests carrying the ark stepped down into the edge of the water. And then here's this statement: for the Jordan overflows all its banks all the days of harvest. The gentle Jordan now is a raging river. It's at flood stage. It could be up to 40 miles an hour when it floods. And what is even worse, it floods over the banks, and there is a deep undergrowth. There were lions that would live in the area around the Jordan. And one writer says it's not so much just the river that they had to cross. Now they have to cross that jungle that's underwater as they go through all that. And modern day visitors to the land of Israel are rarely impressed by the Jordan. It's not imposing. It's like some of the creeks I grew up as a kid. Luxbalala Creek, Yellow Creek in Mississippi, and we'd fish and run trot lines. They just muddy creek, like Flint River here. It's not imposing. And some people say, well, that you can just wade through the Jordan because it's at flood stage when they are here, and it poses no threat to them when it's not at flood stage. And so it's overwhelming. So they stay here for 3 days, and the Jordan River is an important obstacle that they have to cross. In fact, here in these two chapters, chapters 3 and 4, the Jordan River is mentioned 28 times. It's mentioned 70 times in the entire book of Joshua. So this is a critical and significant moment. They have to cross the Jordan. There are songs about this in the Hebrew Scriptures. There's that psalm in Psalm 114. And skip over to chapter 4. Look at verses 23 and 24. After they cross, it says, for the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you had crossed, just as the Lord your God had done to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed, so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the hand of the Lord is mighty, so that you may fear the Lord your God forever. It's intimidating as they are standing here at the Jordan.
Power on.
This is a sound that somebody has recorded from the Jordan at flood stage. Now imagine you're a member of Israel. 3 days, you hear that. You look out, and you just see. And you've got to cross that river. It's swelling its banks. There's the scene. It's swelling its banks. They're probably thinking, how are we going to cross this? I mean, some of the strong men might be able to, cross, but we have children. We have we have the elderly. We have all our animals that are there. And for 3 days, they're standing there before this raging Jordan. And the answer, you must cross by faith. And so look at this text, and there's some things that stand out here. How God tells them how they will cross this Jordan. Look at verses 2 through 4, chapter 3. The first thing, they are to follow the movements of God. So he says in verse 4, he tells notice in verse 3, they're commanding the people. And when you see the Ark of the Covenant and the priests there carrying it, and then in verse 4, you stand at a distance from that ark, about 2,000 cubits. That's about half a mile. You don't get any closer than that. You don't come near it. And then it says, so that you may know the way by which you shall go, for you have not passed this way before. Now, that's kind of strange and interesting, because he says stay about a half mile from the Ark of the Covenant. And the reason is given because you shall know the way you will go, and you've not passed this way before. It seems the reason you stay so far is because of the holiness of God, but also so that everybody can see it. Did some research about how far a human eye, how far can we see? I mean, half a mile away is, it's a pretty good distance away. You stay that distance away from the ark, but then he says, so you'll know. How you know? Well, you know because the priests are leading the way, and you haven't passed this way before. The Ark of the Covenant is very prominent throughout chapters 3 and 4. And the Ark of the Covenant it contained, the manna that God had fed them in the wilderness. He provided for them. It had the tablets of the covenant there. It had Aaron's rod, that had just a dead stick of wood that had blossomed out, because God can do that. Also on top of the Ark of the Covenant was the mercy seat, gold plate, and it's there, and there these cherubim on both sides of that. And then God said, that's where I will meet you. So it's emphasizing God with his people. It's emphasizing God's word. It's emphasizing God is a living God. It's emphasizing also that that's where God meets them and will meet them. And so all Israel is camped on top of this hill that's there. The ark is ahead of them, and they are to follow the movements of God. Hebrews chapter 12 tells us that we're to keep our eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. We're in this race, but we keep our eyes on Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. What happens when we take our eyes off Jesus? You remember the time when the apostles are in a boat and Jesus comes walking to them, and then Peter says, Lord, let me come to you. And Peter jumps out of the boat, and he actually walks on the water as well. But then the text tells us he took his eyes off of Jesus and he began to sink. Peter's probably thinking, I don't walk on water, but I'm walking on water. But then he looks at the storm all around him and he begins to sink. And we got to be careful, of reading that like a parable. It's not a parable, it's actually happened. But the point is to keep our eyes on Jesus. And so the nation's called to keep their eyes on God, to keep their eyes on the ark, to follow the movements of God. Now, the reason I'm preaching this today on the last Sunday of this year is because we stand before a place. See there, he says in verse 4, you have not passed this way before. We haven't passed 2025. That's future. That's coming up. That's something that is ahead of us. And so, just like Israel standing before the Jordan, we're standing before the brink of this new year, and we haven't passed that way before. What are we to do? Follow the movements of God. Keep our eyes on Jesus. And there's another thing he tells them to do. He says to consecrate yourself. In verse 5, that means prepare, dedicate. It's the word for holy. Dedicate, be hallowed, be holy, be separate. And they're going to find out pretty soon the effect of sin on the entire congregation, because when they come to Jericho, God said, you completely destroyed Jericho, don't take anything. And one man does take something, and that brings disaster on all the people. here, as they're about to cross this Jordan, he says, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do signs. He'll do miracles among you. And as we stand before the brink of this new year, keep our eyes on Jesus, keep our eyes on God, and also seek to live holy lives before Him. And then verses 7 through 13, he tells the priest to step out. Look at those verses. Verse 7, the Lord said to Joshua, this day I'll begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, so that they will know that just as I've been with Moses, I will be with you. You command the priests who are carrying the Ark of the Covenant, saying, when you come to the edge of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan. Then Joshua said to the sons of Israel, come here and hear the words of the Lord your God. They are to, when you reach the edge of the waters, he says, you stand still, because God is going to act. And he says, I'm going to make Joshua great in front of the people. In some of the Assyrian text, it talks about how that the Assyrian generals had crossed rivers, and those were renowned acts. And the same thing is like here with Joshua. And he says, you are to step into the water, and I'm going to act. And what act it was, look at verse 13. And it will come about when the soles of the feet of the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, rest in the waters of the waters of the Jordan will be cut off. That is, waters which are flowing down from above, and they will stand in one heap. This is likened to the crossing of the Red Sea, but the crossing of the Red Sea was a separation, the cutting in two. The Jordan River is a river, and so the river, and he tells us in chapter 4, it's at a place around, it's called, the name of the place was Adam, and that's about 15 or 20, if it's the same Adam as today, it's about 15 or 20 miles upriver from there. And so it stops there, and then the rest of the waters run down into the Dead Sea. So it's not, it's a picture, they come to the Jordan River, and then they cross on dry land. So it stops here, and it stops here, and then they cross through. But like 15 miles upriver, it's cut off, but it doesn't stop flowing. It keeps flowing in one heap. So it still flows, but imagine how high that water could go. And then you imagine the people in Canaan as they are seeing this, and they're terrified. So the water stop in one heap and go up. Instead of going down the river, it goes up. And then the rest of the water flows into the Dead Sea. And they cross through on dry land, he says. So when you step in the water, stand still. Why that? Because they're waiting on God. They're waiting on the power of God. It's all depending upon God. Now notice that they had to step out. Sometimes, I'll talk to people and they'll say, I'm waiting on God to act in my life. Well, God's telling you to step out. He's telling you to do something. Step out, but they stood still because they are depending upon God. So imagine as the priests step in, and then the waters just stop and they flow on, and there's dry ground that's there. So we heard the waters of flood. Imagine you start hearing that. Crossing now on dry ground. And it probably would have been louder than that. They probably would have been shouting, and they're carrying animals across. But you had that flood water, and now they walk through on gravel, dry land. And so powerful is this, as we saw in Psalm 114. It says the Jordan turned back. And the psalmist says, why is the Jordan afraid? Why did the Jordan turn back? Look over there again at Psalm 114 that Kent read. What ails you? Verse 5. sea that you flew? Jordan, that you turned back. What caused you to turn back? And the answer is given in verse 7. Tremble, earth, before the Lord, before the God of Jacob. This is a powerful act. God acts again. And in a sense, we've been saying a Jordan stretches before us. There are challenges that are there. Every day we face Jordans, and we face this year, in a sense, as a Jordan. And then a lot of our songs and the songwriters talk about the last Jordan that we face. And there's even one song, I won't have to cross Jordan alone, because God is there. I won't have to face death alone, because God is there. This crossing of Jordan is a powerful act of God in His people here in Joshua chapters 3 and 4. But God is still working, and in a sense is using language that He is defeating Baal. He's defeating all these other gods because He is the living God. Whatever God had done this. I want to read a quote. This is from preacher John Mark Hicks. He says, "Like Israel, we stand on Jordan's stormy banks. We cross the sea in our baptism, and we've journeyed through the wilderness of life nourished. We now face those stormy banks. We face death itself." In a sense, as the years go by, we're facing death, and finally we will face death. Like the Jordan in front of Israel, it's imposing, it's threatening. But we step into the water with confidence and boldness. We pass through the waters of death in order to embrace the promised inheritance. We pass through the waters where we rest from our labors. That's what we're looking for. And so we are to keep our eyes on Jesus, to step out in faith, and to stand still and trust in Him as we are casting our eyes toward the promised land that's still ahead of us. We're going to sing the song 380, Just As I Am. If you're not a Christian this morning, you can't cross Jordan by yourself. You can't make it through Jordan's flood waters. You're called to trust in God. And He calls you to turn away from your sins, confess the name of Jesus, and be baptized. This last Sunday of the year, that seems to be would be an appropriate time to put your trust in God and say, I'm going to follow Him. If you've done that and you've wandered away, it seems to be a very appropriate time for you to say, I'm turning back to Him. I'm trusting in Him. And so we call you to do that, and we're here to help you in any way if you need to come while we stand and while we sing.